Justice Scalia had some very, very clear and important prophetic warnings when the Supreme Court ruled in 2003 by a 6-3 decision in Lawrence v. Texas that there was a constitutional right to sodomy. Justice Scalia raised his voice then. And in 2013, in the case of the United States versus Windsor, when the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, was overturned, he raised his voice yet again. And then last year in the Obergefell case, when the Supreme Court redefined marriage, Justice Scalia raised his voice once again. Now, he hasn't been the only one to raise his voice in dissenting opinions, but his dissenting opinions have often been the most scathing, the most surgical, and in many ways the most prophetic. So there's an article, 2013, in the ABA Journal, Deborah Casson-White's, the article entitled, "Scalia Predicts the Future Once Again in Gay Marriage Dissent." So listen to what Justice Scalia wrote back in 2003. If the Supreme Court is going to find, hear me, a constitutional right to sodomy, what a bizarre position. What a bizarre proposition based on the Constitution. But if they will actually find that right in the Constitution, what will it lead to? Listen to what Scalia wrote in 2003. State laws against bigamy, same-sex marriage, adult incest, prostitution, masturbation, adultery, fornication, bestiality, and obscenity. Every single one of these laws is called into question by today's decision. Now, there are a couple things in his list that you'd say, what does the state have to do with that? What do state laws have to do with that? But let's look at some of the others. He starts with bigamy, and then he says same-sex marriage, adult incest, just those three. On what basis can the court find a, quote, constitutional right, a constitutional right to sodomy, without a constitutional right, say, to bigamy or same-sex marriage or adult incest? Now, here's what's interesting. No sooner was a Supreme Court decision announced in Lawrence v. Texas in 2003 that gay activists were celebrating. New York Times reports this, June 26, 2003, quote, "Gay men and lesbians poured into the streets today to celebrate a Supreme Court decision striking down or strictly limiting the country's last remaining sodomy laws in 13 states. Quote, from Florida to Alaska, thousands of revelers vowed to push for more legal rights, including same-sex marriages." So Scalia asked back then, based on the court's ruling, what justification could there possibly be for denying the benefits of marriage to homosexual couples? He was right. If there's a constitutional right to sodomy, again, which is bizarre, and there's nothing constitutional about it, then how are you going to say that two men cannot, quote, marry if you have a constitutional right to sodomy? You might not see the immediate logic of it, but he clearly did. He clearly saw the connection, as did gay activists celebrating that very thing. Now, let me say this. This was not a law that was enforced, but it was a law that was good to have on the books because it stood as a bulwark against this developing further in society. For example, it is still a law in Singapore, and gay activists have been fighting against it. I spoke with a former Supreme Court justice from Singapore, a committed Christian man, and I spoke to some other leaders there, Christian leaders and others, about this very issue. And the agreement was, even though this is not something that people are policing, they're not going to people's homes and seeing what's being practiced, it's good to have on the books as a bulwark against other aspects of gay activism. That's the case here. Scalia was right. Okay, so according to Justice Scalia, the court has largely, in 2003 he said this, the Supreme Court has largely signed on to the so-called homosexual agenda. You could say since, they've not just signed on, they've signed, sealed, and delivered it. Here are your goals, signed, sealed, and delivered, and realized. All right, now, 2013, the overturning of DOMA. Some critics of Justice Scalia have said this. Actually, he interpreted this ruling too broadly And now justices have been saying, well, Justice Scalia said so. No, he rightly saw the fruit of overturning DOMA. He rightly saw where this was going. So supporters of same-sex marriage have used his word to say, you see, redefining marriage is inevitable. But in point of fact, what Scalia warned about was this, and I'll read it to you. By formally declaring anyone opposed to same-sex marriage an enemy of human decency, the majority, meaning the majority of the Supreme Court, arms well every challenger to a state law restricting marriage to its traditional definition. This is Scalia, 2013, when the Supreme Court overturned the Defense of Marriage Act. Quote, as I have said, the real rationale of today's opinion, whatever disappearing trail of its legalistic argle-bargle one chooses to follow, is that DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, is motivated by, quote, bare desire to harm couples in same-sex marriages. How easy it is, indeed how inevitable, to reach the same conclusion with regard to state laws denying same-sex couples marital status. He was exactly right. It was one of Justice Kennedy's arguments that there's no possible reason to oppose redefining marriage other than animus against homosexual couples, which is absolutely, completely absurd. On every level, it is absolutely absurd. And yet, that is now enshrined in the Windsor versus United States case. It's now enshrined in that case by saying what? By saying United States versus Windsor, excuse me. But by saying what? By saying that if you oppose redefining marriage, you're only doing it for these reasons. That was in Windsor, and Scalia rightly put his finger on it. Now, as the Supreme Court redefines marriage, he and the other three dissenting justices, so the four dissenting justices, all raised their voice, all gave prophetically accurate rulings, Roberts, Alito, Thomas, and Scalia. Listen to what Justice Scalia said. With the court redefining marriage last June, today's decree says that my ruler and the ruler of 320 million Americans coast to coast is a majority of the 9 lawyers on the Supreme Court. In other words, they can now define the meaning of marriage. Who gave the courts that right? Good for Justice Scalia. He also said this practice of constitutional revision by an unelected committee of 9, always accompanied as it is today by extravagant praise of liberty, robs the people of the most important liberty they asserted in the Declaration of Independence and won in the Revolution of 1776, the freedom to govern themselves. You know, Hebrews 11, speaking of Cain, speaking of Abel who was killed by Cain, he being dead yet speaks. Justice Scalia being dead yet speaks, and his words will continue to sound in the days to come. How urgent it is that we elect a God-fearing president who will appoint God-fearing justices to the Supreme Court. Otherwise, we are in big, big trouble in the decades to come.